The grand auditorium buzzed with excitement as the famous singer, known for his bold voice and even bolder attitude, took the stage. Fans filled every seat, hanging onto his every note. But in a moment no one expected, he suddenly stopped mid-performance, turned to a woman quietly sitting in the front row, and called her out. She was dressed plainly, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. The crowd chuckled as he handed her the mic, not out of kindness, but clearly to mock her. The room shifted with uneasy laughter, unsure whether this was part of the show or just pure humiliation. She looked stunned. Her eyes darted toward the exits, her voice caught in her throat. Who was she? Just a simple woman, unknown to the world, dragged into the spotlight for a cruel joke. The famous singer smirked, expecting her to fumble, maybe even run. But she stood still, closed her eyes, and slowly brought the mic to her lips. At that moment, everything seemed to freeze. No one knew what would happen next. Would she crack under pressure, or was there more to her than anyone realized? The lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft glow over her face. The crowd leaned in, breaths held. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was about dignity, courage, and an unexpected moment that would soon shock everyone in the room. What followed would change the entire tone of the night and leave the audience speechless. Her name was Amina. She wasn't from the city, nor did she carry the confidence of someone used to being watched. She had only come to the concert with her niece, who adored the singer. They'd saved 4 weeks to afford the tickets, and she never expected to be noticed, let alone called out in front of thousands. Amina worked at a small sewing shop tucked behind a market. Her days were quiet, her life humble, and music had always been something private, something she sang only while folding clothes or cooking dinner. Never for an audience. The singer, known as Rayon, had a reputation for teasing people, especially during live shows. Some called it entertainment, others said it bordered on cruelty. He'd spotted Amina during the break between songs, and perhaps her simplicity had made her an easy target. Cameras were already zoomed in, capturing every nervous glance she made as she stood there holding the mic. The crowd buzzed, a mixture of laughter, curiosity, and anticipation filling the air. Rayon leaned against the piano, arms crossed, waiting for her to mess up. But there was something in Amina's stillness that felt different. She wasn't begging to leave. She wasn't panicking. Instead, she took one slow breath, like she was centering herself in a storm. Her niece, seated a few rows back, covered her mouth, not from shame, but from hope. No one knew that Amina once dreamed of singing, long before life demanded silence. And now, that silence was about to be broken. As Amina lifted the microphone, the stage lights glared into her eyes, blurring the faces in the crowd. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the faint music beginning to play. It was a song she recognized, one of Rayon's biggest hits. A cruel twist, some might say, to ask her to sing his own song. He smiled smugly from the side, confident that the moment would end in embarrassment. The audience was restless, some chuckling quietly, others watching with wide-eyed curiosity, unsure whether they were about to witness a disaster or a miracle. Backstage, a young sound technician named Layla watched closely. She had seen many people humiliated during these spur-of-the-moment performances, but something about Amina made her uneasy. There was a calm strength in her posture, a quiet defiance beneath her nervousness. Layla leaned toward her headset, whispering to the band to soften the background track just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to let a raw voice rise above. Meanwhile, Amina's niece, Amal, sat frozen, her hands clenched tightly. She knew her aunt had stopped singing years ago after a painful family tragedy. Singing in public wasn't just difficult, it was emotional. And yet, here she was, standing in front of thousands, facing a world that expected her to fail. Rayon tilted his head, arms folded. He didn't know he had just ignited a fire long buried beneath grief and silence. And Amina, despite the tremble in her hands, closed her eyes and took a breath. The first note was seconds away. The first note left Amina's lips like a whisper, delicate and unsure. The audience barely reacted, unsure if she was singing or just trying to gather courage. But as the second line followed stronger, steadier, a quiet ripple passed through the crowd. Heads tilted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Ryan's grin faded slightly, his arms dropping from his chest as he leaned forward. Listening more intently, Amina's voice, though untrained, carried something rare, emotion unfiltered by ego, pain wrapped in warmth. Every word trembled with truth, and with each verse, her confidence grew. She wasn't just singing. She was telling a story, her story, buried for years, now rising in front of an audience that had expected her to break. The orchestra behind, her initially holding back, began to follow her energy, their tones richer, fuller, echoing her rising power. Backstage, Layla stared at the soundboard, goosebumps crawling up her arms. Something was happening out there that no equipment could create or fake. Even the stage crew stood still, some with their hands over their mouths, watching a moment no one had expected. Rayan shifted uncomfortably. The attention was no longer on him. Whispers among the judges began, words like raw, unexpected, and real. His plan to mock her had backfired, but he couldn't stop it now. Then, just before the final chorus, Amina's eyes opened, scanning the room. She spotted Amal in the crowd, tears streaming down the girl's cheeks. With that glance, she took a deep breath, preparing to unleash a final note that would change everything. Amina closed her eyes and belted out the final note with a depth that stunned even the musicians behind her. It was raw, almost aching, and it echoed through the auditorium like a wave. The room fell silent, frozen by the weight of what they had just heard. But before anyone could applaud, the unexpected happened. Rayan stepped forward, clapping slowly with a forced smile. Then, in a tone dripping with sarcasm, he said, "Beautiful." For a village lullaby, the crowd murmured, confused. His ego, bruised by her performance, was not ready to let her have the moment. But just as the tension built, an elderly man in the front row stood up. He was a well-known music critic, rarely seen at such local events. His voice rang out, calm, but firm. That wasn't a lullaby. That was truth. And truth doesn't need polish to shine. The spotlight quickly shifted again. Not only had Amina proven herself, but now respected voices were rising in her defense. Still, Rayan wasn't done. He walked back to the mic and, in front of the stunned audience, challenged Amina to sing an unrehearsed opera duet with him. "If you're truly ready," he said, eyes narrowed, "let's see how far your voice carries when it's not your story." Gasps filled the room. Amina froze. This wasn't just about proving herself any. It was about survival in a room that had already judged her once. All eyes were now on her again, waiting to see if she would rise or fall. Amina stepped toward the microphone with trembling hands, but her eyes were steady. The orchestra looked to Rayan for the cue, but he was already watching her, expecting her to falter. The conductor lifted his baton, and the soft intro of the duet began. Amina waited for her moment, then sang. Her voice, though quiet at first, carried a clarity that cut through the room. Rayan joined in, his voice rich and practiced, but for the first time, he wasn't the center of attention. Amina didn't just keep up, she led with emotion, pulling the crowd into every note. By the second verse, whispers spread through the audience. Rayan's tone grew strained. He was trying to match her energy, but something had shifted. His polished technique couldn't match the raw soul in her performance. People leaned forward, eyes wide, some even recording. When the final harmony approached, Amina hit the high note flawlessly, holding it with grace and power. The entire auditorium erupted in applause before the last note faded. But then something unexpected happened. Rayon, clearly shaken, turned to the audience with a forced grin only to have his microphone buzz and cut out. The sound crew looked confused. A tech assistant stepped onto the stage and whispered to the host. Moments later, the announcement came. Due to multiple complaints of unprofessional behavior earlier tonight, Rayon will no longer be judging future performances. A stunned silence hit. Amina, still catching her breath, realized she hadn't just sung. She'd changed everything, as the crowd gave Amina a standing ovation. She stood motionless for a second, overwhelmed. Her eyes searched the room, not for applause, but for her mother in the front row. Silent tears said everything words couldn't. This wasn't just about music, was about dignity, self-worth, and the quiet strength that too often gets ignored. When she finally stepped down from the stage, people reached out to shake her hand, to thank her, to ask where she had trained. But she hadn't trained in any conservatory. Her only stage had been her kitchen. Her only teacher, the old radio her father once fixed with spare parts. The event organizers approached her backstage, inviting her to return for a solo concert the following month. Her reaction wasn't pride, it was disbelief. She had come here expecting to be dismissed, mocked like before, but she was leaving as the night's highlight. Meanwhile, Rayon quietly exited through the back, the weight of public scrutiny already beginning to settle on his shoulders.